70,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses in a single year. Let that number sink in for a moment. 70,000 lives gone, families destroyed, communities hollowed out. And when a Chinese official was asked about this crisis, he paused, gave a faint smile, and said something chilling. Perhaps now you understand what the 19th century felt like for us. That sentence stunned American diplomats. To many Americans, it sounded cruel, heartless, almost evil. But to the Chinese side, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't sarcasm. It was history speaking. Because 180 years ago, British gunboats forced a drug into China that shattered its society. Opium flowed in, silver flowed out, and an entire civilization collapsed under addiction, humiliation, and foreign domination. Today, the poison flows in the opposite direction. Fentanyl devastates American streets, while many of its chemical origins trace back to China. Some in China call it coincidence, others call it karma. But this story is not really about drugs. It's about memory. It's about why China reacts with fury to American tariffs, tech bans, and warships. Why a trade dispute feels like an invasion. Why a semiconductor restriction feels like cultural destruction. To China, these are not isolated events. They are chapters of the same war. The Opium Wars never ended. They simply changed form. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you don't understand those wars, you will never truly understand U.S.-China relations today. Every headline will seem irrational. Every reaction will feel exaggerated. But once you see the pattern, everything suddenly makes sense. So let me ask you this. Why would the most powerful empire on Earth go to war? Just to sell drugs? The answer takes us back to the early 19th century, to the moment when a wound was opened that still hasn't healed. To understand how this catastrophe began, we have to rewind to the early 19th century, when global trade revolved around a single obsession: China. In Europe, especially in United Kingdom, Chinese tea wasn't a luxury. It was a daily necessity. Porcelain filled aristocratic homes. Silk defined fashion. Demand was insatiable. But China had a simple rule. They didn't want Western goods. No British textiles, no British machinery. Payment was accepted in one form only: silver. For decades, silver flowed steadily from Britain into China. By the 1830s, the situation had become a nightmare for London. The trade deficit was massive. Britain was bleeding precious metal, and the political pressure to fix the problem was growing. Parliament debated, merchants panicked. And then someone proposed a solution, brilliant in calculation, catastrophic in consequence. Britain controlled vast territories in India. In those territories, poppies grew easily. Opium could be refined cheaply. So the plan was simple: grow opium in India, smuggle it into China illegally, sell it to Chinese merchants, and use the profits to buy tea. Silver would flow back, the deficit would disappear. On paper, it was economic genius. In reality, it was social annihilation. By the late 1830s, tens of thousands of chests of opium were pouring into Chinese ports every year. Each chest weighed roughly 60 kilograms. That meant millions of kilograms of narcotics flooding a society that had neither legal protections nor medical understanding of addiction. Within a single generation, an estimated 12 million Chinese were addicted. That was roughly 10% of the population. Think about that number for a moment. Imagine 1 in 10 Americans addicted to opioids, not today, but in a pre-industrial society with no rehab centers, no modern medicine, no safety net. Families collapsed, productivity vanished, corruption exploded. And just as devastating silver, the lifeblood of China's economy, reversed direction and drained out of the country to pay for the drug destroying it. China tried to stop it. The Qing government banned opium repeatedly. They issued moral appeals. They increased penalties. But the smuggling continued, protected by British commercial interests and naval power lurking just offshore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't accidental. It was policy. When China finally enforced its own laws, Britain didn't negotiate. Britain went to war. Not to defend its citizens, not to protect trade routes, but to protect the right to sell drugs to a sovereign nation that was trying to save itself. When China finally decided it had endured enough, it did what any sovereign nation would do. In 1839, a senior imperial official named Lin Zexu was sent to Canton with a clear mandate: stop the opium trade, by force if necessary. Lin moved decisively. He confiscated and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of British opium publicly in full view of foreign merchants. It was an assertion of law, sovereignty, and moral authority. He even wrote a respectful letter to Queen Victoria asking a simple question: why is it illegal to sell opium in Britain but acceptable to poison China with it? Britain's answer was not diplomacy, it was gunboats. What followed was the First Opium War, and it was brutally one-sided. China's defenses consisted largely of wooden ships, outdated cannons, and a military that had not fought a modern naval war. Britain arrived with steam-powered iron gunboats, long-range artillery, and professional naval crews. Chinese coastal cities were bombarded. Rivers were sailed upriver with impunity. The war wasn't a contest, it was a demonstration. When it ended in 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, and this is where the real damage began. The treaty demanded massive financial reparations, millions of silver dollars. China had to open 5 major ports to British trade whether it wanted to or not. Tariffs were fixed in Britain's favor. And one small island, barely noticed at the time, was permanently ceded to Britain: Hong Kong. But the most humiliating clause of all was this: China was forced to tolerate the very opium trade that had destroyed its society. Let that sink in. A foreign power invaded, won, and then legally compelled China to accept the poison that caused the conflict in the first place. This treaty became the first of what Chinese history calls the unequal treaties: agreements signed under military threat, laws imposed at gunpoint. Over the next 100 years, more would follow, by Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and others. Ports seized, territories carved up, cities occupied. In Chinese education, this period has a name: the Century of Humiliation. And it is not taught as distant history. It is taught as a warning. The lesson is drilled into every generation. When China is weak, foreign powers do not show mercy. They exploit, they dictate, and they humiliate. This is where modern Chinese psychology begins, not with communism, not with Mao, but with the moment China learned that moral arguments mean nothing when you lack power, and that sovereignty, once lost, is never gently returned. Now let's jump forward almost 2 centuries, out of the age of gunboats and into the age of spreadsheets, tariffs, and press conferences. In 2018, the United States, under President Donald Trump, launched a sweeping trade war against China. The justification sounded familiar. The trade relationship was unfair. America, the argument went, was losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year. China wasn't opening its markets. Something had to be done. From the American perspective, this was normal statecraft. Tariffs are leverage. Pressure creates concessions. That's how negotiations work. But inside China, the reaction was explosive and deeply emotional. Why? Because Chinese policymakers and the public weren't hearing a technical trade dispute. They were hearing an old accusation, repeated almost word for word. In the 1830s, Britain complained that it was losing silver to China. Trade was unfair. China wouldn't buy British goods. Therefore, Britain argued, it was justified in forcing change. In 2018, the language was strikingly similar. The numbers were different, the currency was different, but the logic was identical. We are losing, therefore you must open up. On our terms. The weapon had changed. Instead of warships, there were tariffs. Instead of cannons, there were percentage points, 25% on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. But the structure was the same. Open your markets or suffer economic punishment. Agree, or the pressure escalates. When China eventually signed the so-called Phase 1 trade deal in early 2020, many Americans saw it as a diplomatic win. China agreed to purchase massive amounts of American goods under threat of further tariffs. Deal done, case closed. But in China, the symbolism was devastating. Officials privately compared it to the treaties of the 19th century. Documents signed not because they made sense, but because refusal meant catastrophe. On Chinese social media, phrases like Unequal Treaty 2.0 trended for weeks, not because of the details of soybean imports or energy purchases, but because of the feeling of being coerced, of being cornered, of signing under pressure imposed by a stronger power. This is where Americans and Chinese talk past each other. Americans see bargaining. Chinese see humiliation replayed in modern form. To Washington, tariffs are policy tools. To Beijing, they are gunboats with better branding. And once you understand that, China's fury suddenly stops looking irrational. It looks historical. To understand why the technology war cut even deeper than the trade war, we have to go back to the year 1860 during the Second Opium War. British and French forces marched into Beijing and reached a place that symbolized the very peak of Chinese civilization, the Old Summer Palace, known in Chinese as Yuanming Yuan. This was not just a palace. It was a vast complex of libraries, gardens, artworks, scientific instruments, and historical records, an embodiment of Chinese cultural confidence. And it was burned to the ground, not because it had military value, not because it posed a strategic threat. It was destroyed deliberately as an act of humiliation, a message. Even the French writer Victor Hugo condemned it, calling it a crime against civilization. Today, the ruins still stand in Beijing, intentionally left unrestored. Every Chinese schoolchild visits them. The lesson is clear and unmistakable. This is what happens when China is weak and foreigners decide to make an example. Now fast forward to 2019. The United States moves to restrict Huawei, China's most advanced technology company, cutting it off from American semiconductors and key software. At the time, Huawei was leading the world in 5G infrastructure. It was ahead of European competitors, ahead of South Korean firms, and yes, ahead of American companies. Then, almost overnight, the supply chain was severed. From the American perspective, this was about national security. Concerns over espionage, backdoors, and state influence were, and still are, real. But that is not how the move was interpreted in China. Inside China, Huawei wasn't just a company. It was proof that China could innovate at the highest level, proof that it could build something world-class without Western permission. And suddenly, that symbol was crippled. On Chinese social media, an old phrase resurfaced: "Remember the Summer Palace." Images circulated side by side, black and white photos of the burned ruins next to Huawei's logo. The message was unmistakable. When China builds something great, the West doesn't compete. It destroys. Not with fire this time, but with sanctions. Huawei's smartphone revenue collapsed almost immediately. Engineers who had grown up visiting the Summer Palace ruins now watched their life's work suffocate under export controls. To Americans, this was policy. To Chinese engineers, it felt personal, historical. This is the psychological mechanism at work: the burning of cultural achievement in 1860, the crippling of technological achievement in 2019. Different centuries, different tools, same emotional wound. To China, the tech ban was not just about chips. It was symbolic violence, history repeating itself in a new language. When Americans see satellite images of artificial islands rising from the South China Sea, the instinctive reaction is simple: aggression, expansion, a rising power bullying its neighbors. But from Beijing's perspective, those concrete runways and radar towers are not symbols of conquest. They are insurance policies, written in blood and memory. To understand this, we have to return once again to the Opium War era. In the 19th century, foreign navies, especially Britain's, dominated China's coastline. Warships sailed wherever they wanted. They entered rivers, they blockaded ports, they shelled coastal cities like Guangzhou and Shanghai with impunity. China's navy, made up largely of wooden junks, was helpless against steam-powered ironclads. The message was devastating and unforgettable. China could not even defend its own waters. That humiliation burned itself into Chinese strategic thinking. The lesson was brutally clear. If you do not control your seas, someone else will, and they will use that control to dictate your fate. Now fast forward to the modern era. The United States conducts regular freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. American aircraft carriers sail through nearby waters. From Washington's point of view, this is about international law and open sea lanes. But in Beijing, it triggers a completely different memory. Foreign warships off our coast again, history replaying itself. So China responded the only way its history has taught it to respond, by ensuring it would never be helpless again. Starting in the mid-2010s, China dredged massive artificial islands, built runways, installed radar systems, and deployed defensive weapons. The West protested. China ignored the protests. Because from Beijing's perspective, this was not provocation. It was prevention. This mindset is sometimes described by Chinese strategists as a never-again doctrine. The numbers tell the story. The People's Liberation Army Navy expanded rapidly, becoming the largest navy in the world by ship count, not to patrol the Atlantic, not to dominate Europe, but to ensure that no foreign fleet would ever again dictate terms off China's coast. Here's the tragedy. Two sides are looking at the same behavior and seeing entirely different meanings. The United States sees militarization. China sees survival. The South China Sea isn't just a geopolitical flashpoint. It's a scar from the Opium Wars, resurfacing in concrete and steel. And until that scar is acknowledged, every patrol, every island, and every confrontation will feel like the opening move of a war that, in China's mind, never truly ended. So why does any of this matter today? Because the Opium Wars may have ended on paper in the 19th century, but in the Chinese mind, they never truly stopped. They evolved. They adapted. They reappeared in new forms. Tariffs instead of treaties, sanctions instead of gunboats, chips instead of cannons, and now, tragically, drugs once again crossing oceans in the opposite direction. Here is the core problem between the United States and China. They are living in two different historical timelines. Americans see individual events, trade disputes, tech bans, naval patrols, each one isolated, technical, negotiable. China sees a pattern, a repetition, a single long story that began in 1839 when foreign powers forced their way in and dictated China's fate at gunpoint. To China, these are not policy disagreements, they are existential threats wrapped in modern language. That gap in memory is dangerous. When one side remembers everything and the other remembers almost nothing, miscalculation becomes inevitable. What looks like overreaction to Washington feels like survival to Beijing. What feels like leverage to America feels like humiliation to China. And when both sides believe history is on their side, compromise becomes harder with every passing year. The irony is bitter. Opium once destroyed millions of Chinese lives and hollowed out a civilization. Today, fentanyl is destroying American communities. Different century, different victims, same moral corrosion. History has not healed. It has metastasized. Pain has turned into justification. Memory has turned into poison. Understanding this does not mean excusing bad behavior. It does not mean agreeing with censorship, coercion, or aggression from any side. But it does mean seeing reality clearly, seeing the game beneath the game, seeing why the past keeps hijacking the present. The question we are left with is simple and deeply uncomfortable. Can a wound that is 180 years old ever truly heal? Or will it define the entire 21st century relationship between two nuclear powers? The Opium Wars are over, but the poison they released is still in the system, and until it is confronted, not denied, not exploited, but understood, it will continue to shape every decision, every crisis, and every near miss between the United States and China. If this video changed how you see that relationship, leave a comment. This conversation matters more now than most people realize.